On July 14, 1944, at 4:10 hours, a single armored fighting vehicle of the Allied advance halted at the eastern edge of a hedgerow-lined agricultural corridor approximately 2.3 kilometers west of a river crossing. The vehicle was a medium tank of the period, weighing approximately 30 metric tons, powered by a gasoline engine producing just under 400 horsepower. Its crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, bow gunner. The narrative that follows concerns the experience of this single crew, sealed inside the vehicle after it was disabled, while the surrounding battlefield continued to shift for the remainder of the day and into the night. At 4:12, the tank was oriented on a bearing of 078 degrees, facing east toward gently rising ground. The terrain consisted of cultivated fields broken by earthen embankments and dense hedgerows, standing 1.5 to 2 meters high. Visibility at that hour was limited to approximately 400 meters due to low cloud cover and residual ground mist. Ambient temperature was measured at roughly 14 degrees Celsius. The ground was damp from rainfall during the night, reducing traction for track vehicles and complicating movement across the fields. The crew had been awake since 2:30. Fatigue was already present but controlled. Each crew member wore standard-issue cotton and wool uniform layers, with steel helmets kept within arm's reach rather than worn, due to confined interior. The tank's interior air temperature was cooler than expected at that hour, hovering around 16 degrees Celsius, but would later rise significantly once the engine heat accumulated and the vehicle became immobile. The primary armament was a medium-caliber rifled tank gun, manually loaded, with a barrel length exceeding 40 calibers. The gun was fitted with basic telescopic optic, providing fixed magnification and a narrow field of view. The trigger mechanism required deliberate pressure and produced a predictable break after moderate resistance. Ammunition carried included high-explosive rounds for infantry and fortifications and armor-piercing, capped rounds designed to defeat enemy vehicles at moderate range. Each round weighed several kilograms, stored in racks along the hull sides and floor. Secondary armament included coaxial and hull-mounted machine guns chambered in rifle-caliber ammunition, belt-fed, air-cooled, and capable of sustained fire, but limited by ammunition supply and barrel heating. Compared to standard infantry weapons, these machine guns offer higher sustained rates of fire, but lack flexibility of elevation and traverse once the tank was stationary. At 4:20, the engine was brought to idle. Fuel level was slightly above half capacity. The commander conducted a brief visual scan through the cupola periscopes, which were narrow and provided segmented views. No enemy movement was observed at that time. Radio communication with adjacent units was intermittent due to terrain masking and atmospheric conditions. At 4:37, the tank was ordered to advance approximately 200 meters to a shallow depression that provided partial hull-down positioning. Movement was slow, averaging less than 10 kilometers per hour due to the wet ground. The driver compensated by maintaining steady throttle input to prevent track slippage. At 4:41, a sharp mechanical impact was felt on the right side of the hull. The tank jolted to a halt. Engine RPM dropped abruptly as the driver instinctively cut throttle. Within seconds, smoke began to enter the crew compartment from the engine bay. Thin but acrid, the assistant driver reported loss of track tension on the right side. The tank had struck a buried anti-vehicle mine. The explosion did not penetrate the hull, but it severed the right track and damaged the suspension assembly. The vehicle could not move under its own power. At 4:43, the engine was shut down to reduce fire risk. Internal lighting was switched to low intensity to preserve battery power. At that moment, the surrounding battlefield was quiet. Distant artillery could be heard to the north, estimated at several kilometers away. The crew remained inside. Exiting the vehicle was assessed as high risk due to unknown enemy observation and the lack of immediate infantry support. The commander ordered the hatches to remain closed. Between 4:45 and 5:30, the crew conducted internal checks. Ammunition racks were inspected for fire or damage. None was found. The radio was tested and briefly established contact with the platoon command element, which acknowledged the tank's immobilization, but could not immediately provide recovery or security. The instruction was to remain concealed and await further developments. As daylight increased, Visibility improved to approximately 800 meters. The mist dissipated unevenly, leaving low ground still partially obscured. The tank silhouette remained partially concealed by the hedgerow, though its gun barrel protruded slightly beyond the foliage. By 6:10, engine heat had dissipated, and the interior grew cooler again. Condensation formed on metal surfaces. Crew members shifted positions minimally to conserve energy. Water was rationed. No food was consumed at that stage. The battlefield around them began to change. At 6:25, distant small arms fire was audible from the east. At 6:40, intermittent machine gun bursts indicated infantry contact along the forward line. None of this involved the immobilized tank directly, but it established that the area was contested and unstable. At 7:05, the first indirect fire rounds impacted approximately 300 meters to the north. The crew listened carefully, estimating caliber and direction. The rounds were likely medium artillery, not specifically targeting the tank's position. The ground transmitted vibrations through the hull, subtle but persistent. From 7:30 onward, the crew remained stationary, sealed inside the vehicle. Time passed slowly. Watches were checked repeatedly. The commander recorded times and observations in a small notebook, maintaining routine to counter fatigue and anxiety. Outside, the sound of battle increased incrementally, signaling that the tank, though disabled, remained within an active and evolving combat zone. By 7:45 on July 14, 1944, ambient light had reached full daylight conditions. Cloud cover remained at approximately 6/10, producing diffuse lighting with minimal shadow contrast. From inside the tank, external visibility depended entirely on periscopes and vision slits, each providing a narrow, fixed-angle view. The commander rotated the cupola periscope incrementally every 5 minutes, maintaining a disciplined scan pattern from north through east to south, then back again. No movement was detected within 300 meters during this period. At 8:10, the sound of track vehicles was detected to the southeast. The low-frequency vibration suggested armored movement at a distance of at least 1 kilometer. The sound grew clearer by 8:18, then faded, indicating a change in direction rather than approach. Enemy armored units were likely maneuvering beyond direct line of sight, using the same hedgerow network for concealment. Inside the tank, air quality deteriorated slowly. With the engine off and all hatches sealed, oxygen levels remained adequate but stale. Carbon dioxide buildup was perceptible as mild headache and increased breathing effort. The crew adjusted by minimizing unnecessary movement and speech. No internal ventilation fan was operated to avoid drawing attention through audible noise. At 8:40, a single artillery round detonated approximately 120 meters west of the tank's position. The crew felt a concussive force through the hull floor. Dust fell from interior surfaces. This round was closer than previous impacts, suggesting artillery fire was now ranging across the area rather than passing incidentally. The commander marked the time and bearing. No follow-up rounds landed immediately. Between 8:45 and 9:30, sporadic rifle fire could be heard moving laterally across the front from north to south. The pattern suggested small infantry units advancing by bounds. Enemy doctrine at this stage of the campaign emphasized infiltration along hedgerows, avoiding open ground. The immobilized tank, though still concealed, now represented a fixed point in a fluid infantry battle. At 9:12, movement was detected through the right side periscope. 2 enemy soldiers were observed briefly at a distance of approximately 180 meters, moving west to east along a hedgerow. They were carrying individual weapons and packs, moving cautiously, pausing frequently. They did not appear to notice the tank. The commander chose not to engage. Firing would have revealed the tank's position and invited anti-tank response. The decision prioritized concealment over immediate action. At 9:40, the weather changed subtly. Wind increased in the west at approximately 8 to 10 kilometers per hour. This caused hedgerow foliage to move irregularly, complicating visual detection of human movement. It also carried sound unpredictably, making distance estimation less reliable. By 10:05, interior temperature had risen to approximately 22 degrees Celsius due to body heat and solar warming of the hull. Crew members removed outer layers where possible. Sweat accumulated, especially on hands and necks, making grip on metal surfaces less secure. The loader wiped condensation from ammunition casings to prevent slippage during handling. At 10:22, enemy mortar fire began impacting the general area. The first round landed approximately 200 meters east. Subsequent rounds adjusted closer, walking toward the hedgerow line. Mortars, with their high-angle trajectory, were well suited to hedgerow terrain. The crew recognized the pattern as ranging fire rather than immediate suppression. At 10:31, a mortar round detonated roughly 60 meters south of the tank. Shrapnel struck the hedgerow, cutting branches and leaves. None struck the hull directly. The crew braced instinctively, remaining silent and motionless. The commander ordered the gunner to align the main gun toward the most likely infantry approach route, but not to fire unless directly threatened. From 10:35 to 11:20, mortar fire continued intermittently, never striking closer than approximately 40 meters. The pattern suggested the enemy suspected a position in the area, but had not confirmed it. Enemy infantry doctrine emphasized probing fires to fix suspected strong points before committing assault elements. At 11:45, firing intensified to the north. Machine gun bursts were sustained, indicating contact between larger infantry elements. The sound of shouted commands was audible faintly, carried by the wind. The immobilized tank remained untouched, but increasingly isolated as the front shifted. At 12:10, the crew consumed small amount of water. No food was eaten. Fatigue manifested as slowed reaction times and reduced alertness. The commander enforced a rotation of observation duties to maintain vigilance. Each crew member was assigned 10-minute observation periods, followed by rest, even though space constraints made true rest impossible. At 12:38, enemy small arms fire struck the hedgerow, directly in front of the tank. Bullets snapped through leaves and struck earth, producing sharp, close impacts. One round struck the tank's mantlet, producing a metallic crack, but no penetration. The enemy had likely detected the tank's outline or suspected its presence. The crew remained inside, weapons trained but silent. Firing back would have confirmed their position. The enemy fire ceased after approximately 2 minutes, suggesting a tentative probe rather than deliberate attack. By 13:15, the battlefield noise shifted again. Artillery fire moved further west. The sounds of tracked vehicles diminished. Infantry movement continued sporadically. The tank crew, sealed inside a disabled vehicle, remained a stationary element amid a moving and adapting battle. Pressure increased not through direct attack, but through uncertainty, isolation, and gradual encroachment of enemy activity. Time passed in measured increments, marked only by watch faces, distant detonations, and the constant need to remain alert within a confined steel space. At 13:32 on July 14, 1944, a distinct change occurred in the acoustic environment around the immobilized tank. Footsteps became audible at close range, irregular but deliberate, approaching from the southeast. The sound was muffled by earth and vegetation, but the cadence suggested multiple individuals moving cautiously, maintaining spacing of several meters. The commander signaled silently for all crew members to remain still. No internal movement was permitted beyond controlled breathing. At 13:36, through the forward periscope, a partial view of enemy infantry became visible at a distance of approximately 45 meters. Only lower legs and equipment were visible beneath the hedgerow line. The soldiers were moving westward, parallel to the tank's front, likely attempting to bypass what they believed was a static position. Their weapons were carried at low ready. No heavy anti-tank equipment was visible at that moment. The gunner adjusted the elevation of the main gun by a few degrees, aligning it with a narrow gap in the hedgerow. The optics field of view was restricted, requiring precise alignment. The gun's breech remained open, with an armor-piercing round partially seated but not locked. The loader maintained physical contact with the round, ready to complete the loading sequence if ordered. At 13:41, one enemy soldier stopped abruptly, approximately 38 meters from the tank's position. He knelt and appeared to examine the ground. This pause increased the likelihood that the tank's track damage or silhouette had been detected. The commander assessed the risk. Allowing the infantry to approach closer could result in the placement of explosive charges or anti-tank grenades. Engaging now would reveal the tank's presence, but might disrupt the immediate threat. At 1343, the commander authorized the use of the coaxial machine gun only. The gunner depressed the trigger for a controlled burst, lasting approximately 2 seconds. Approximately 20 rounds were fired. The round struck the hedgerow at chest height, penetrating foliage and earth. One enemy soldier was observed to fall backward. The others immediately dispersed, seeking cover. The sound signature of the machine gun was sharp and unmistakable. The engagement lasted less than 5 seconds. The gunner ceased fire immediately to avoid prolonged exposure. No further movement was observed in that immediate sector. At 1345, return fire struck the hedgerow and the tank's frontal armor. Rifle-caliber rounds impacted the hull with metallic impacts, leaving superficial marks but no penetration. The armor thickness at that angle exceeded the penetration capability of standard infantry rifles at that range. The crew remained stationary, aware that sustained fire could attract heavier weapons. Between 1350 and 1420, enemy fire continued intermittently. Individual shots in short bursts suggested cautious probing rather than coordinated assault. The enemy had confirmed the presence of a tank, but had not yet committed specialized anti-armor assets. This hesitation reflected standard infantry doctrine. Fix the armored target, then neutralize it with appropriate weapons rather than frontal assault. At 1405, a pause in firing occurred. The crew used this interval to check internal conditions. Ammunition expenditure was minimal. Machine gun ammunition remained above 90% of capacity. The main gun had not been fired. Internal temperature had risen to approximately 25 degrees Celsius. Sweat accumulation increased, and dehydration became a concern. Each crew member took a measured sip of water. At 1422, the sound of digging was faintly audible from the northeast. This suggested the enemy was establishing temporary firing positions or preparing covered approaches. The commander adjusted observation priorities, focusing on likely anti-tank weapon approach routes, gaps in hedgerows, shallow ditches, and sunken lanes. At 1437, a single anti-tank rifle round struck the tank's right side armor at an oblique angle. The impact produced a sharp crack and miners spalling inside the hull, sending small metal fragments into the crew compartment. No crew member was injured, but the presence of spall indicated the use of heavier infantry anti-armor weapons. The enemy had escalated their response. At 1440, the commander ordered the main gun loaded with a high explosive round. The loader completed the loading sequence, locking the breech. The gunner adjusted elevation to target a suspected firing position approximately 90 meters northeast, identified by disturbed foliage and muzzle flash. At 1442, the main gun fired a single round. The recoil was substantial, compressing the suspension slightly despite the vehicle's immobility. The high explosive round detonated within the hedgerow, producing a localized blast and scattering debris. The effect was immediate. Enemy fire from that sector ceased. The gun's discharge produced a significant dust cloud around the tank's muzzle, momentarily obscuring visibility. The sound echoed across the fields, unmistakably identifying the tank's position to any observer within several kilometers. At 1450, mortar fire resumed, now more accurately placed. 2 rounds detonated within 30 meters of the tank, one to the front left, one to the rear right. Shrapnel struck the hull repeatedly. The crew braced, aware that repeated near misses increased the probability of damage to external fittings, optics, or tracks. From 15 to 1535, the enemy maintained pressure through indirect fire and occasional small arms bursts. No direct assault occurred. The enemy appeared to be containing the tank rather than attempting immediate destruction, likely prioritizing other objectives. Inside the tank, fatigue deepened. Muscles stiffened from prolonged immobility. Hearing was dulled by constant noise. Time perception slowed. The crew remained sealed inside, engaged in a series of brief, precise actions punctuated by long intervals of waiting, scanning, and controlled restraint as the battlefield continued to adapt around their fixed position. At 1548 on July 14, 1944, the pattern of enemy activity changed again. The mortar fire ceased abruptly. In its place, there was an extended period of relative quiet. This absence of fire was itself significant. the crew recognized as a transition phase, commonly preceding a deliberate action rather than withdrawal. Enemy forces were likely reassessing, reallocating assets, or coordinating an approach using heavier anti-armor weapons. The commander ordered all crew members to reset mentally and physically. Observation intervals were shortened to 5 minutes per position to counter fatigue-induced lapses. Each periscope view was checked systematically, with particular attention to low ground and hedgerow junctions. The gun remained oriented toward the northeast, where previous enemy activity had been detected. At 16:05, cloud cover thickened slightly, reducing overall light levels. Shadows softened further, making it more difficult to distinguish movement from vegetation. The wind dropped to approximately 4 kilometers per hour, reducing background noise. Under these conditions, sound carried more clearly. At 16:17, metallic clanking was faintly audible from the east. The sound was irregular and intermittent, consistent with equipment being moved rather than vehicles advancing. The distance was estimated at 150 to 200 meters. This suggested the repositioning of a crew-served weapon rather than infantry maneuver. At 16:26, a distinct muzzle flash was observed through the commander's periscope at a distance of approximately 110 meters, partially obscured by hedgerow foliage. Almost immediately, a shape-charged projectile impacted the tank's frontal armor. The impact produced a sharp, concussive force and a loud metallic crack. The projectile failed to penetrate due to the angle of impact and armor thickness, but the external surface was scorched, and spall was again produced internally. The enemy had introduced a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon. Compared to earlier anti-tank rifles, this weapon relied on chemical energy rather than kinetic penetration, making it more dangerous to armored vehicles at close range. At 16:28, the gunner fired a single high-explosive round toward the flash location. The round detonated slightly short, impacting the hedgerow's base. The explosion uprooted soil and vegetation, but did not conclusively neutralize the firing position. No immediate follow-up fire was observed. Between 1630 and 1700 hours, the enemy attempted 2 additional shots from different positions, each time changing angle and distance slightly. One projectile struck the tank's left side armor at approximately 70 degrees obliquity, again failing to penetrate. The second passed overhead and detonated behind the tank, showering the rear hull with fragments. The enemy was adapting by relocating firing positions rapidly, exploiting the tank's immobility and limited traverse. The tank crew adapted in response by minimizing exposure time at each periscope and by firing only when a firing position could be reasonably fixed. At 17:05, the commander ordered the use of the hull-mounted machine gun to suppress likely approach routes. Short bursts of 10 to 15 rounds were fired into hedgerow gaps and ditches at ranges between 60 and 120 meters. Ammunition expenditure increased, but remained controlled. The intent was not to eliminate specific targets, but to deny movement and force the enemy to remain at distance. At 17:30, internal conditions deteriorated further. The interior temperature reached approximately 28 degrees Celsius. Humidity increased due to sweat and limited ventilation. Hands slipped on metal surfaces despite efforts to keep them dry. The smell of cordite lingered after each discharge, compounding air quality issues. At 17:48, radio contact was briefly reestablished with friendly forces. The message was short and fragmented. Friendly infantry elements were engaged elsewhere and unable to reach the tank before nightfall. Recovery assets were unavailable under current conditions. The crew was advised to hold position, if possible. At 18:10, the enemy shifted tactics again. Small arms fire ceased almost entirely. Instead, sporadic movement was detected at greater distances, beyond 200 meters. This suggested the enemy was disengaging from close assault and preparing to isolate the tank overnight rather than destroy it immediately. As evening approached, light levels dropped gradually. By 1845, visibility through periscopes was reduced to approximately 150 meters. The tank silhouette became less distinct, benefiting concealment, but also reducing the crew's ability to detect approaching threats. At 1900 hours, the crew prepared for night conditions. Internal lights were kept off. Watches were synchronized. Each crew member was assigned extended listening periods, focusing on sound rather than sight. The main gun remained loaded, but safety protocols were strictly maintained to prevent accidental discharge in confined space. The battlefield entered a transitional phase. Daylight combat activity diminished, replaced by uncertainty, reduced visibility, and the heightened risk of close-range engagement under cover of darkness. The tank remained disabled, sealed, and operational only as a static weapons platform, while both sides adapted to the approaching night. At 1918 on July 14, 1944, full dusk conditions set in. The sun dropped below the western horizon, leaving a residual band of low light that faded steadily. Cloud cover increased to nearly 8/10, eliminating most ambient illumination. From inside the tank, visual observation through periscopes became severely constrained. Beyond approximately 60 meters, shapes could no longer be reliably identified. The crew transitioned fully to auditory surveillance. Each man focused on a distinct sector, listening for changes in sound patterns. Footfalls, metallic contact, disturbed vegetation, or whispered commands. The tank's steel hull amplified low-frequency vibrations, transmitting subtle cues through the floor and seat mounts. At 1932, the first clear indication of close enemy movement occurred. A faint scraping sound was detected along the southern hedgerow, estimated at 25 to 30 meters from the tank. The sound was intermittent, suggesting deliberate, controlled movement rather than hurried advance. The commander assessed the risk as elevated. At that range, handheld anti-tank charges or magnetic explosives could be employed. The gunner aligned the main gun toward the southern approach, elevating slightly to account for the hedgerow's height. The loader stood ready, hands on the breech handle, prepared to clear or reload as required. The assistant driver monitored the hull machine gun position, finger resting on the trigger guard, without applying pressure. At 1941, a sharp metallic click was heard against the tank's exterior near the right side hull. The sound was brief but distinct. The crew froze. No explosion followed immediately. The commander counted silently, tracking seconds. Magnetic charges, if placed, typically detonated within a short delay or via pull ignition. At 1943, the commander ordered an immediate response. The hull-mounted machine gun fired a short burst downward and outward along the right flank, approximately 30 rounds in total. The round struck earth and hedgerow at close range. Almost simultaneously, the main gun fired a high-explosive round toward the same sector, elevated slightly to clear the hedgerow. The detonation occurred at close proximity, estimated within 20 meters. The blast shook the tank violently. Loose equipment inside the hull shifted. The concussive force caused temporary disorientation. External noise spiked sharply, then dropped off. No further movement was detected in that immediate area. At 1950, the crew assessed damage. No internal fire, no penetration. External fittings could not be visually confirmed due to darkness. The possibility that an explosive device had been dislodged or prematurely detonated could not be ruled out. The crew remained at heightened alert. Between 2000 hours and 2110, no direct contact occurred. The battlefield soundscape diminished significantly. Distant artillery was no longer audible. Occasional rifle shots echoed far to the east, but did not approach the tank's position. The enemy appeared to have withdrawn to safer distances, possibly concluding that the tank could be contained rather than destroyed under night conditions. Inside the tank, physical strain intensified. Muscles cramped from prolonged static posture. Breathing became shallow due to stale air and accumulated fatigue. The interior temperature stabilized around 26 degrees Celsius, but humidity remained high. Sweat soaked uniform fabric, increasing discomfort and the risk of heat exhaustion. At 21:25, light rain began to fall. The sound of droplets on the hull was initially faint, then steady. The rain cooled the exterior armor gradually, producing condensation inside. The temperature dropped slightly. The rain also masked sound, reducing the crew's ability to detect subtle movement. Conversely, it also reduced the enemy's ability to approach quietly. At 22:10, a brief radio transmission was received. Friendly forces reported limited forward movement and ongoing engagement several hundred meters to the west. No immediate relief was possible. The tank crew was instructed to hold position through the night if able. From 22:30 onward, the crew entered a sustained endurance phase. Watches were rotated in 2-hour increments. Each man attempted micro-rest periods of several minutes at a time, eyes closed but posture maintained. True sleep was not achieved. Any unexpected sound triggered immediate alertness. At 23:40, movement was detected again, this time at a greater distance, approximately 80 meters to the northeast. The sound was consistent with small groups repositioning rather than approaching. No engagement occurred. The enemy appeared to be disengaging from the immediate vicinity, likely consolidating positions elsewhere. By 0:30 on July 15th, 1944, the battlefield around the disabled tank had largely stabilized. The decisive period had passed without a final assault or destruction of the vehicle. The crew remained sealed inside, physically intact but exhausted, having survived hours of escalating pressure through restraint, limited engagement, and disciplined adaptation.